that I had used was a letter written from a local attorney in Jamaica to the owner of the plantation who lived in England at the time. And the local attorney, David Ewart, wrote to Lord Richard Penryn, sort of given really a detailed account of how he was managing the pregnancy of enslaved women on this Jamaica plantation. And in his letter, he talks about how instead of having women work as individuals, he had them working in groups of 2 or 3, and in some cases 4. And the reason he did this, he explains, is that this would protect the women's pregnancies. And so he said, women could work in a team of 2 and 3, and this would allow some women to rest while others were working. And the kind of work that he was describing in this letter was feeding canes to the mill. So this is a sugar plantation in Jamaica. And I sort of returned to that letter and zeroed in on it for several reasons. One of which is the historiography of slavery in the Caribbean concludes that the slavery system was gender blind, that there was no distinction made between men and women, and pregnancy did not offer any kind of protection for enslaved women during parturition. So this really stood out to me because what I was seeing here was exactly the opposite of that. And so I became really curious, well, was this an outlier? How common was this practice? Or is it in response to a particular set of events on that individual estate? Because there were certainly literature that pointed to a few individual proprietors who were experimenting for various reasons in reducing their dependence on the transatlantic slave trade. And so they were experimenting if they had equal proportion of men and women, would this sort of facilitate for the natural reproduction, quote unquote, natural reproduction of enslaved people. So there were a few exceptions to this rule. And so that's one story that I'm going to return to. The second story, or the second piece of it that I'll talk about, is at the same time I was working on an essay for a material feminist piece. And I was sort of reading the work of folks like Suzanne Bordeaux. And there's one quote that I sort of read in her work where she talks about, and I'm going to read it here, where she says, "Is pregnancy merely a cultural construction capable of being shaped into multitudinous social forms, or does the unique configuration of embodiment presented in pregnancy, the having of one another within oneself, simultaneously both part of oneself and separate from oneself, constitute a distinctively female epistemological and ethical resource?" And I was haunted by this quote for several years, and in particular the phrase where she says, "Is pregnancy merely a cultural construction?" And I was haunted by it because I was sort of, I didn't fully buy into the argument of postmodernists and post-structuralists who sort of emphasize that reality is sort of created through language, right? It sort of denies the real, the material, and says, everything is discursive, everything, or reality is created through language. And I thought through Suzanne Bordeaux's quote, "Is pregnancy merely a cultural construction?" So we talk about gender, we talk about race as socially constructed. Gender is socially constructed, race is socially constructed. And pregnancy was a little bit different, right? So there is sort of the real embodiment of pregnancy. There is sort of the body being very different during the experiences of pregnancy. And so I was trying to make a connection between what I was seeing in this letter written by the attorney in Jamaica on the one hand, and then sort of Suzanne Bordeaux's question about the cultural constitution or cultural construction of pregnancy. And so in a way, I think my book sort of became a middle ground between trying to understand one, the way in which the body has agency of its own. I think the older literature, sort of the postmodernist literature, sort of emphasizes this idea that the body is simply a blank slate, and so society and culture scripts onto the body what it wants that body to become. And I was seeing, through the lens of pregnancy, this was really not quite the case. You were seeing the plantation agents in Jamaica responding very clearly and very specifically to pregnancy. So they were making allowances, they were making changes for pregnancy. the question that I had to deal with is, why were they making these changes? And did historians of the Caribbean, did historians of slavery really get it wrong in saying, well, the plantation system was gender blind? And so for me, it was sort of working through this whole idea of gender blindness to suggest the importance of temporality in understanding the claims that are made on the body of the enslaved, but also understanding the ways in which the discourses around the body might shape the experiences of the body, but at the same time, the body speaks back, right? So the body has agency. And what that means for me, as I sort of, went through the process of the book, is exploring the ways in which white enslavers in the Caribbean wrote about, you mentioned the inability of the black body to feel pain, but thinking through legal practices like part of sanctuary venturum, which is to say that black women are reproducers of the slave system. And in the aftermath of that, you have the writings, or several writings, that delineate the black body as being able to reproduce as many children, right? They're able to have children without needing respite from work. Black women are, quote unquote, super breeders. But this was not quite the case in reality. So one, you sort of had the discursive, on one hand, in the creation of a racialized system of slavery that sort of, identifies the black body in this particularly racialized sense. But the reality on the ground was that enslaved black women faced exceptionally high rates of maternal mortality. More than half of their infants did not live beyond the first 9 days. And so the reality was that the excesses of punishment, the excesses of the working regime really had a cost on the body of the enslaved woman. And so on the one hand, you have this racialization of the black body, but the reality was very different. And so we come to Ewart's letter because by the time we get to the 1780s, what is happening is the mobilization of abolitionists in England. And they created this really elaborate scheme to say, well, if the planters were attentive to the material conditions of enslaved women, then perhaps they would reproduce the labor force naturally, and then perhaps we would not to rely on the inhumane system of the slave trade. And so what is happening by the 1780s is that the abolitionists in England are calling into question a lot of what the planters were saying that the enslaved women were capable of doing. And so what occurs as a result of questioning that discourse, I'm thinking discursive and discourse at the same time. So what emerges out of those discourses, thank you, having two trains of thought at once, right? What emerges out of that is that the enslavers now had to change the ways in which they managed enslaved women. So they now had to change their working responsibilities. They had to adjust the ways in which they were punishing them. You had doctors who then sort of migrated from England who would now, emerge on the plantations in an attempt to then control women, control their reproductive ability. And so what happens is a shift. So 1780, creates this shift, both in terms of that works, discourse, right? That's coming out of England, and what's also emerging on the ground. So what's emerging on the ground in Jamaica is a shift away from saying, well, women could reproduce or have as many children without respite from work, to say, well, it's other things that they're doing that interferes with the reproductive process. And these other things that they're doing is that they're ignorant of their bodies. They don't quite know how to medically manage their pregnancy. So they sort of, emphasize some of the rituals that enslaved women were performing, just in the same way that doctors in England and in France are saying, well, it's those superstitious midwives whose practices are actually, causing these high rates of mortality. So the book sort of goes through and explains and explores those contestations, both within, both between the abolitionists and planters on the one hand, about enslaved women's reproductive ability and what's actually causing them, to lose their children. And on the other hand, it sort of looks at, well, what did these representations a woman's reproductive ability mean, on the one hand, for how their working lives were managed, and then the other hand, in terms of the deployment of doctors, what does this actually mean for the ways in which enslaved women medically treated their own bodies and the kinds of conflicts that emerges around that. The final piece that I'll say, and I'll give the respondents to talk later on, is the ways in which some of this lingers and sort of continues to today. And I sort of recently heard of a case of LaShonda Hazard, a 26-year-old mother, I think in Rhode Island, who went into the hospital and she reported that she had stomach pain. She was feeling stomach pain. She was pregnant, and they sort of sent her home and said, oh, it's really nothing. And she made a Facebook post and said, I'm literally dying and they're ignoring me, right? And this happens a lot, where that narrative that Black women don't feel pain, it was created in the context of the racialization of slavery, but it sort of continues today, and it shaped medical practices then, and it continues to shape medical practices today. And I sort of bring out that story because what then emerges in my book is thinking through how, the reality, the embodiment of the body through pregnancy on the one hand, but also other embodiments such as the feeling of pain, gives an opportunity for doctors, planters, abolitionists, the state in general, to then create particular ideas about the Black body which had real life consequences for those bodies, both then in the context of enslaved women, how they were treated, and then today for Black women too, how they're also treated within the medical profession. Thank you.
First commandment of giving a comment, thou shalt not go long. So, all right. First, I'd like to begin by thanking all of the organizers of this conference. I'd like to give special thanks to my colleague Arden for giving me the opportunity to comment on such a phenomenal book. Now, as many of us were up very early this morning, I thought I'd begin my response the way I'm always trying to get my undergraduates to begin their papers, and that's with a clear thesis statement. My clear thesis statement is this. Deirdre Cooper Owens' book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, is an outstanding study that makes deeply original contributions to a wide variety of fields, ranging from the history of slavery to gender history to, of course, the history of medicine. And you should all read it if you haven't read it already. So that's my thesis. Now, to elaborate a little, I'd like to begin also with Toni Morrison, but not with the Black Book, but rather with her argument in Plain in the Dark, her classic work of literary criticism, in which Morrison examines how American literature is haunted by Blackness, in which she contends that Blackness orchestrates the very texts that marginalize the existence of Blackness. In Medical Bondage, Professor Cooper Owens makes what I read to be a congruent argument, which is an argument about the ways in which the history of modern medicine in general and the history of American gynecology in particular are haunted by African American slavery. Interrogating a rich array of sources, including medical journals, 19th century court cases, the diaries of slave owners, and oral history interviews conducted with former slaves, Professor Cooper Owens highlights the importance of enslaved African Americans to the development of American gynecology. In doing so, she offers a radical reversal of the conventional narrative of the development of gynecology, one that celebrates how elite white men, like Dr. James Marion Sims, conducted pioneering experiments across the 19th century that created groundbreaking medical knowledge, all for the benefit of women's reproductive health. Professor Cooper Owens illuminates how this groundbreaking knowledge was made possible by ownership of and experimentation on enslaved women. She reveals, for example, how the aforementioned Dr. Sims, a white South Carolinian, developed his surgical practices in the 1840s by operating on a number of enslaved women. And I should add that Professor Cooper Owens is so unflinching in recounting the details of the medical procedures performed on enslaved women that I would amend the praise we generally accord to compelling books. We often say that a book is so good that we can't put it down. But Medical Bondage is a book so powerful that I sometimes needed to put it down. As she unravels the relationship between slavery and gynecology, Professor Cooper Owens also takes care to foreground the contributions of enslaved women themselves to the history of gynecological experimentation. Building productively on the work of historians including Deborah Gray White, Nell Painter, Jennifer Morgan, and Tara Hunter, Professor Cooper Owens underscores the still too often overlooked reality that American slavery was a fundamentally gendered institution. She unpacks how enslaved women's experiences of slavery were fundamentally structured by their gender. Reading Medical Bondage, we come to understand how enslaved women became the objects of gynecological experimentation, in large part because their bodies were conceived of as vessels of conception. That is to say, because enslaved women birthed slaves, and in doing so perpetuated the institution of slavery, white slaveholders and white physicians were deeply attentive to enslaved women's reproductive health. Equally important is how Professor Cooper Owens illustrates the extent to which enslaved women were never simply the objects of reproductive procedures, but were also active participants in gynecological knowledge production and its practice. She reveals the all-important, yet all too invisible roles of enslaved women, both as care workers and indeed as medical experts. How enslaved women worked as nurses and midwives on southern plantations and within slave hospitals. And most strikingly, how enslaved women contributed their own medical knowledge, often derived from West African cultural practices, both to improve the medical practices of white men and also at times to subvert those practices by providing alternate forms of medical care to enslaved patients. Just as legal historians have helped us to recognize the existence of legal pluralism, how multiple sources of legal authority coexist with one another at any given place and time, Professor Cooper Owens shows us how slave plantations and hospitals were sites of what I'd call medical pluralism. Within these sites, multiple sources of medical knowledge, white and black, free and enslaved, male and female, cohered, complemented, and conflicted with one another, as gynecology was both practiced on and administered by enslaved women. Now I'd like to take some time to highlight a few of the many, many contributions that are made in medical bondage. The first should already be clear from what I've said, and that's how this book offers nothing less than a new genealogy of the origins of modern American medicine. Just as historians of slavery have stressed that we might better begin our survey courses on the rise of the modern West, not with the Renaissance, but with the transatlantic slave trade, Professor Cooper Owens helps us to see how we might better think about the origin story of modern medicine as being one that is inextricable from, and in fact dependent upon, the history of African American slavery. In Medical Bondage, we learn that even if modern American gynecology could have existed without slavery, it did not come to exist without slavery. This insight, I think, has a number of really important implications. For one thing, in US history, we often think about medical progress primarily being driven in the North, in New York or in Boston. But Medical Bondage shows us that medical knowledge never had an exclusively northern or free provenance, but is also deeply indebted to a southern and enslaved origin story. For another, Medical Bondage compels us to revise the common assumption that white supremacy is a synonym for stupid. By zooming in on the surgeries that white Southerners performed on the reproductive organs of enslaved women, we see instead how white supremacy was literally on the cutting edge of 19th century medical practice. Another contribution of Medical Bondage is to help us think anew about historical experiences of exploitation across the color line. In the 4th chapter of our study, Professor Cooper Owens shifts from recounting the medical experiences of black enslaved women in the American South to those of Irish immigrant women in the American North. In doing so, She intervenes in long-standing scholarly debates over the extent to which the lives of Irish immigrants and enslaved people can or should be analogized. As I read Professor Cooper Owens, she is arguing that the medical lives of enslaved and Irish immigrant women were similar, but never the same. Similar, for example, because Irish immigrant women in institutions like the New York State Women's Hospital were often compelled to suffer through surgical encounters with American gynecologists who had previously operated on enslaved women. Different, for example, because Irish immigrants were not owned, and because white doctors thus could not exert the same level of control over their reproductive lives. By thus juxtaposing the medical experiences of enslaved and Irish women, medical bondage does invaluable work in helping us to parse the workings of gendered forms of oppression across the color line and across the boundaries of slavery and freedom. One final contribution I'd like to emphasize is how Professor Cooper Owens helps us to understand the workings of racial ideology. Throughout medical bondage, and especially in the book's concluding chapter, Professor Cooper Owens deploys the term medical superbodies to explain how white physicians interpreted the bodies of enslaved black women through a framework of sameness as well as difference. On the one hand, physicians characterized black women as embodying hypersexuality and as possessing capacities to endure pain that were far superior to those of white women. And yet, as Professor Cooper Owens puts it, black lives mattered medically because they made white lives healthier and better. But black lives were only understood to matter medically because white doctors knew that black women's sexual organs were identical to white women's. By attending to both of these lines of thought, Professor Cooper Owens ultimately clarifies how racial ideology operated in an enslaved medical context. It provided white doctors with a knowledge system that allowed them simultaneously to pose and overcome the contradictions of operating on black bodies that were held to be both the same and different from white bodies. Now, it goes without saying that an important book like Medical Bondage raises important questions, and I'd like to shift now to raising just a few of those questions. The first, now it also says we're talking about the disembodied third person to addressing the author directly. The first relates to how your book complicates prevailing historiographical interpretations of Southern slaveholders' paternalism. Now, when we think about Southern slaveholders and their professed paternalism toward enslaved people, one thing we think about is how slaveholders claimed that medical care was a component of their paternalistic care for their slaves. As one white Southerner put it in 1854, the master is a commissioner of the poor on every plantation to provide food, clothing, and medical care for his people. I think most historians nowadays would say that this sort of paternalistic talk was generally a theory that wasn't actually applied in practice. But I'm wondering if it would be fair to say that your book offers us a more troubling account of slaveholders' paternalism. Because in your book, we see how slaveholders did in fact provide medical care for their slaves, that the form this care took didn't actually improve the institution of slavery. So my first question is, does your account of medical practice under slavery help us to see that insofar as paternalism was put into practice, it in fact made the institution of slavery not more livable, but in fact more exploitative? Second question is one that I'm sure you've been asked before, and it has to do with the analytical, or really the ethical utility of referring to slavery as inhumane. In your book's introduction, you write that I have attempted to present enslaved women as complicated, whole, and fully human, though the physical and psychological costs exacted by slavery were inhumane. What I'm wondering about, though, and something I definitely struggle with in my own writing, is how and whether historians should characterize slavery as an institution in which human beings were subjected to inhumane treatment. Here, of course, I'm thinking about the work of scholars like Walter Johnson, who have argued that American slavery was such an oppressive regime, in no small part because slaveholders were deeply aware of the humanity of enslaved people, and because they attempted to conscript that humanity for their own benefit. As I noted in summarizing your book, you show us how even racist white physicians understood their black patients to be human beings. And so my second question is, To what extent should we understand slavery's medical history as one characterized by humanity? And to what extent should we also be thinking about slavery's medical history as one that's really perversely predicated upon physicians understanding and treating enslaved people as human beings? Third question I have is the question that every historian always has, and that's a question for more context. One statistic I dug up while writing this was how during the American Civil War, 30,000 Union soldiers, most of whom were white men, bless you, underwent amputation during wartime. And of that 30,000, more than 25% died. And this, of course, shouldn't be a surprise to any of us in the room, because by today's standards, hospitals and medical instruments were makeshift, and most surgeons were learning how to perform surgery on the job. And so I realize this distinction I'm about to draw absolutely trades on a non-collision, but I'm curious to what extent you think the brutality of the operations you describe was the product of the conditions of slavery and or the racism of medical practitioners, and to what extent was the brutality also the result of the fact that medical practice in the 19th century was deeply substandard by today's standards. Lastly, the final question I'd like to raise is about how we might relate the history of medical bondage to the practice of medicine in the present. In the haunting afterword of your book, you write about your own medical experiences as you discovered that you couldn't become pregnant naturally. And after I finished your afterward, I found myself thinking about what Condoleezza Rice said, I think back in 2017, about how America was born with a birth defect. It was slavery. Of course, after reading your book, these words definitely took on a more troubling meaning. But thinking about what you said in light of what you wrote about your own medical life got me thinking about how Americans individually or collectively should be responding to the birth defect of American slavery in the present. As many of us know, back in 2018, New York City removed a statue of Dr. James Marion Sims from Central Park, along with the plaque which read, "His brilliant achievement carried the fame of American surgery throughout the entire world," but which said nothing about how his brilliant achievements were made by exploiting enslaved women. But taking down a statue clearly isn't enough to atone for the narrative your book provides us, especially in a country where the healthcare coverage gap is deeply racialized, in which African Americans are much less likely to benefit from Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, in which even elite African Americans such as yourself are subject to flagrantly racist medical assumptions and treatment. I realize this is a provocative question to end on, but rather than simply thinking about job programs or free college tuition, I'm wondering, what might a medical form of reparations look like? Just to conclude, I hope this response has corroborated the thesis statement I opened with, that Medical Bondage is an outstanding book, one that deserves a wide readership, and one that really got me thinking. And I should add that I can't wait to read material from your next project on the history of mental illness during the era of slavery, so thank you very much.
So I'd like to add my thank you to Arden and to the organizers of this conference, and to Deirdre Owens and to Sasha Turner for these two wonderful books. And so just to cut to the chase, I loved Contested Bodies, and so there's no hidden but coming. However, when participating in a panel like this, kind of book review panel, book discussion panels, I always sort of struggle with what the best form for a response is. And I use that term form deliberately because it's one of the issues that really determines the way that I see myself in relation to the field, both of early American and early Atlantic studies on the one hand, and of literary studies on the other. The response, my direction for taking this response has been essentially to sort of think about and to track my own reaction and my own experience when reading this book, and to sort of provide an example of, I want to say wrestling, but not so much wrestling, but coming to terms with what the form of this book is, how the argument unfolds, and sort of to think about questions at various points in the book. So less of a kind of a broad kind of summary that I would write in a book review to be published in a journal. It'll be more sort of questioning in this sense. So in approaching this, I sort of mentioned I think there are two real fields through which I'd like to consider these issues. One, that of the medical and health humanities on the one hand, and second, of early American or early Atlantic or Black Atlantic history on the other. These are two distinct fields, but their intersection is really fascinating. I think their intersection is a place that opens for, it is open and it makes available so much really interesting thought, both for the historical fields in and of themselves, but also in a kind of anachronistic way to fold back and to consider what the 17th, the 18th century, the 19th century have to teach us about ideology and culture in the 21st century, as well as medicine in the 21st century. And I think we've heard already multiple examples of that, specifically in relation to modern medical practice. So one of the interesting things to me about sort of the archives of medical and health humanities on the one hand, and early American studies on the other, is that they're in a way antithetical to each other. That medical and health humanities very much is about, the archive is very much in tune with thinking about bodies and showing us bodies, and not just bodies, but parts of bodies as well. Whether we're thinking about an injured hand, an injured foot, an injured liver, whatever. Whereas in the early American, early Atlantic, and Black Atlantic history, we're much more focused on thinking about persons, people. And that distinction, the ambiguity, the ambivalence between body and person is really complicated. And one of the questions that drives my own work is to think about how do we reconcile these two? Are they reconcilable? I'm not sure that they are. But my approach to working out that problem is very much informed by questions of form and method, the relationship between form and method. And so this is where then I begin with my reading of the book. So Contested Bodies is an extremely important book in these multiple fields that considers the place of pregnancy and childbearing in the late history of the Atlantic slave trade. That is to say, roughly the period from the rise of British abolitionist movement in the late 18th century to abolition itself. As with any project on the slave trade, there are a number of key archival and methodological questions that determine the narrative trajectory of Turner's research, and I'd like to consider briefly what and how these appear in the Contested Bodies. So the book opens with a claim that, quote, a conceptual approach that focuses on the body of enslaved persons is useful in challenging generalizations about the sexual division of labor because it requires us to examine the organization of their lives and labor according to specific bodily functions and the meanings given to them, end quote. Intuitively, this is a clear and sensible approach for a number of reasons. From an archival standpoint, the disciplinary and regulatory mechanisms of the slave trade and of plantation management required detailed attention to the organization and division of labor on the one hand, and relied on sustained observation of bodies and bodily functions on the other. So given the breadth of the medical archives, scholars are left with a broad range of approaches for analyzing and synthesizing these biological data, what we would today call biological data. More particularly, given the nature of the 18th century imperial and colonial medicine, the archive itself is overwhelmingly structured by these kinds of focused anatomical observation. That is, the archive is largely an archive of bodies and body parts, rather than of persons. So I'll admit that in reading this, while I was intrigued and attracted to this statement, I was simultaneously uncomfortable with this initial approach. For example, and most particularly, I was concerned that reliance on an imperial and colonial archive dedicated to sustaining slavery's global economic order risked instrumentalizing the enslaved body. Or, to paraphrase Sadia Hartman's work, I wondered whether the implicit reduction of African and Afro-Caribbean persons to their bodily functions might not risk replicating the originating violence that the slave trade and the slave trade archive had already performed on those persons. Erasure, silencing, abstraction, and generalization. So the question I had going in to the opening chapters is what happens to personhood when we focus on the biopolitical regulation of enslaved bodies? I added biopolitical there. This is not a term in the book itself, much to the credit of the book. So this is a question of archive and medicine, that method that lies at the core of virtually all scholarship attending to Atlantic slavery. The materials at the core of this work, my own included, slave trade databases, plantation records, and especially the writings of plantation physicians, are materials that resist personhood because the production of those data is itself predicated on the non-personhood of its subjects, or the vision of those subjects as laboring bodies. and this is something that the book explores and unfolds very nicely. So how one resists this problem is not obvious, but the further I read into contested bodies, the more impressed I was by the way that Turner grappled with it. To be specific, the early chapters of contested bodies do push in the direction of instrumentalization, beginning with late 18th century abolitionist arguments that tied colonial reform to the reproductive capacities of female slaves, continuing with statistical analyses of gender disparities in the slave trade, and the alteration of gendered labor routines advocated by medical and disciplinary regulation. These first three chapters do focus then on the largely abstracted enslaved body, and therefore seem to perform the work of the colonial archive, at least in some respect. But then here is where contested bodies begins to move in a different and crucial direction. First, in the transition between the third and fourth chapters, Turner focuses with increasing intensity on the mutually integrated ideological work of abolitionist and pro-slavery arguments. So to quote two moments in the text, first, by linking abolition and reform to women's reproductive lives, abolitionists forced planters to pay closer attention to maternal and natal health and care after the 1780s. And then the second passage is planter investment in childrearing intended to secure future serval laborers, not to prepare subjects of a free colony as abolitionists intended. So what Turner is doing here in this shift between the first and second half of the book is to demonstrate the ways in which abolitionist and pro-slavery arguments align with one another at the node of discipline and regulation. That is, whereas both positions stand politically or stood politically in contrast with one another around the question of abolition, they were nevertheless committed to a shared economic project, which is maximizing colonial profits in the service of empire. So what looks like an antithetical position is a mutually reinforcing position in very important ways, in ways in which sort of that fall back on what I was arguing prior, that is, whether we're looking at abolitionists or pro-slavery arguments, both of those arguments tend to instrumentalize the enslaved body. So that is to say, the abolitionists are trying to, quote unquote, ameliorate enslavement and especially childbearing in order to regulate the slave system and to, quote unquote, improve it. And plantation owners, enslavers, I should say, sorry, take up that call, but transform it into a push to sort of continue the slave system, particularly after abolition of the trade in 1807. So this then shift gives us an opportunity to consider how this formal structure of contested bodies encodes Turner's crucial methodological intervention, and I'd love to hear her talk further on this matter, so the way that she thinks about this, the trajectory of the book, because it's not strictly speaking, and I love this about the book, it's not strictly speaking a chronological history. We come back to the same times again and again, and so it's partially chronological, but more sort of a thematic revisiting. And at each position in the revisiting, the argument itself, the focus of, or the attention to the archive changes slightly and moves us towards an increasingly important attention to agency. So, right. So whereas the book begins with the instrumental paradigm I outlined above, it moves towards an accounting of agency and resistance within the plantation system in the final four chapters. These each in turn cover the struggle between European and African medical authority in the treatment of illness, the biopolitics, and I'm using that term, of neonatal death, forms of maternal authority and resistance, and finally, the political and laboring lives of children. So this thematic and intellectual shift in the book arises in response to Turner's observation that, quote, by promoting the ending of slavery through biological reproduction, abolitionists forced a reconceptualization of motherhood and childcare in the world of sugar and slavery, end quote. And this reconceptualization of motherhood, in turn, helps us to revisit the archive and recognize how it encodes modes of enslaved resistance. As Turner continues, quote, enslaved caregivers rejected and contested the mandates issued by plantation agents that required them to relinquish parental authority. They defended their reconceptualizations and approaches to nurturing, comforting, and caring for children. The mundane rituals of breastfeeding and providing food morphed into resistance, or what we might consider maternal resistance. And so both of these are sort of 2/3 of the way in the book on page 202. So here, Turner fundamentally transforms the method and narrative direction of contested bodies, moving away from the abstraction of unpersoned bodies and toward the internalized subjecthood of enslaved persons. I can't emphasize enough the significance of this turn, both for early American studies and medical and health humanities. But I would underscore that what Turner rightly sees as the ultimate paradox of this subjectivity, namely that even as enslaved women use their control over childbirth to marshal a modicum of power in their lives, women's protective efforts to ensure their children's survival also extended the proprietary interests of slaveholders and the colonial interests of abolitionists. So we see the way in which this sort of pernicious system, even resisted itself, seems to be folded back into the continued production of the slave system. So this leaves us certainly in an ambivalent, if not pessimistic position. And so some of the final questions I would end with is how do we navigate these positions? And is there a way, and are there ways, given the archive with which Turner is working, are there ways in which we can approach that archive to think about the interiority of enslaved life? And this goes very much, I think, to Deirdre's question as well about not wanting to ventriloquize, right? This is a sort of a key moment, a key position in the question of scholarship and the slave trade. So some remaining historiographic and methodological questions is how do we read the Black Atlantic archive for this material moving forward, or how do we, the term I like to use, especially as a literary critic, because it emphasizes the position of unknowing that we have, and not just unknowing, but the position of being lost, I think, that contemporary scholars must maintain every time we go into the archive. How do we become literate in recognizing Black agency in the archive? And that term literate is I sort of fundamentally, when I talk to my students and others, we have to admit our illiteracy in the face of something so that we can recognize whether we can become literate and how to do that. Sorry, that was and so finally, the anachronistic questions that I have, and I love anachronism, perhaps because I'm a literary critic. What does this book look like for work in the contemporary medical and health humanities? I think we've had a beginning of those discussions. What are the contemporary implications of these questions, including, like for me, beginning in the 17th century, the history of inoculation, in the 18th century, which is deeply embedded in the history of the slave trade. We can think about the history of sexually transmitted diseases, whether we're looking at syphilis and yaws in the 18th century, or looking, for example, at Tuskegee experiments in the 20th century, and turning finally to obstetrics and gynecology in particular. So I will leave there and open up for conversation.
Sasha, would you like to respond to any of what Cristobal raised?
Sure. So thank you. Wow. Very much. It's always, great to hear certain reviews or to read certain reviews, and you sort of wonder, oh, that was my book?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And especially from literary scholars, they often have a way with words that paint a different kind of picture than historians. I'm sort of struck by your comment about the body as an instrument to be used, and that's something I come back to quite a lot, especially thinking through Horton Spiller's concept of the flesh, and it's something that I have wrestled with. So there were two things, or several things. One is my choice in deciding to use or not to use certain images. And there's one particular image that I use in the opening of the book, and I sort of decided to use it because when we sort of reach or are introduced to certain things in the archive, and the story about the enslaved person, the disembodied enslaved or the disembodied object, we sort of accept the story as told there. Versus attempting to wrestle with the story, attempting to tell the story, then I think it allows you an opportunity to tell a different story. And so there's a way in which the archive tells a particular story about the enslaved, but I think part of the role of the historian is not to simply accept the archive as a conduit to a reality, but is actually presenting a skewed reality, and how can we sort of uncover a different reality, a different story, by interrogating not just the archive, the material that's there, but the very composition of the archive itself. The second thing that struck me from your comments, and again, sort of thinking through the body as an instrument to be used, is I have had a mission, I had several missions in the book, one of which is I really wanted to destabilize the image of abolitionists as saints and saviors. And I think it was really very important for me to talk about what I was seeing in terms of their work. And that's also another moment when I say, when we sort of leave the stories in the archive, we accept those stories as told. But if we are able to suggest an alternative reading and to sort of, you know, call the archive to task about their very composition, then I think we're sort of better able to, you know, see a glimpse of a potentially different reality. So thinking of Wilbur, for example, and the way in which he becomes celebrated as this figure of liberation, of science, and in looking at, you know, the way he used enslaved women as an instrument to liberate and to end slavery, but to protect the economic interests of the British Empire, I think that was a really critical story to be told. So I think the hard line that historians of slavery have to take is that when we try to reject or to resist this narrative of the enslaved body being an instrument in service of, that is a reality that we have to sit with. And if we want to pretend or write a narrative that suggests otherwise, I think we then use the enslaved to serve our own purpose. And we then sort of reiterate or ratify that objectification. So while I'm a huge fan of Hartman's work and other historians and literary scholars who caution historians to be mindful of, you know, how we're sort of replicating that violence, I think to shy away from the violence of story or to become, you know, too squeamish about the violence of slavery, I think we sort of do a disservice in really trying to understand the full nature of slavery. And the piece that relates to agency, the agency of the enslaved and how we sort of see the agency manifest, I think we're unable to understand the complexity of the exercising of agency without fully understanding the multitudinous form of violence, right? So we can't shy away from violence and want to see agency without understanding the violence. And the part that you sort of brought up about the book, the ways in which I suggested maternal resistance, and to argue that a simple practice that we naturalize as breastfeeding actually has a resistance potential if we understand the ways in which the female body is being put to use, not just by enslavers, but also by doctors, by abolitionists, by state officials. And so I think both pieces have to go hand in hand. And while, you know, we do have to maintain that caution in not sort of, you know, ratifying that violence, without understanding that violence, we miss the opportunity to then see the tremendous struggle and craft. I think there's a moment when I think this was James Scott's work that I sort of was using when he said that, you know, sometimes the resistance strategies had to be oblique, right? So we have to understand the obliqueness of violence to then understand the obliqueness of agency. And, you know, thinking through the personhood, we get to the personhood too by, you know, by reading through, and this is very Cifuentes, you know, reading against the biased grain of the archive, and again challenging the very way in which the archive are constituted, that you are sort of seeing the disembodiment, but even within those moments of disembodiment, you do sort of see the personhood emerging. In terms of my approach to the narrative, I didn't want to do a chronological history because I also didn't want to replicate the narrative of slavery to freedom that we see in slavery studies as a whole and that we see in studies about abolition. There's a way in which there is the assumption that there was a projection, a progression from a brutal system toward an ameliorative system toward, freedom. And in fact, you're actually, bending and folding across those terms, and freedom is existent within slavery, but even more critically, in these moments of so-called liberation, and even these liberators, in terms of my own argument, they were even more insidious, I think. The abolitionists were even more insidious than the enslavers themselves. And so that was part of the reason why I didn't want this chronological narrative, because the way in which we've understood the shift from slavery to the ending of the slave trade, to amelioration, apprenticeship, and emancipation is this linearity, and I really wanted to push back against that. And I also wanted to center the women themselves, even when I wasn't centered as a woman. So you sort of picked up very correctly that the first 2 chapters or 3 chapters was really this abstracted, disembodied body, so really more the flesh of the enslaved. And in a way, what I did was sort of, think through conception. So thinking of the molecules that are coming together in conception, and then, the maturation, the conception, the pregnancy, and the delivery, etc. So I sort of wanted to have the subtext to be pregnancy, even in those moments when I was talking more so about the abolitionists, the state officials and planters, until I even got to the women themselves, that the subtext of the narrative that runs through is really centering pregnancy in and of itself. So that was also, quite a deliberate.
And to me, that was one of the really, it was effective and really exciting things about the book. Like I said, and you sort of little about, oh, this is what you're doing, this is amazing. And I think, it partly reflective of that is the use of Mary Prince, sort of in the latter half of your book, which sort of demonstrates, I think, sort of all of the points that you're making here, both in her relation to the Atlantic world and enslavement and childbirth on the one hand, and in her relation as a figure circulating within the abolitionist movement on the other in the 1830s. That was fantastic.
Deirdre, would you like to respond?
Yes. First, thank you. I feel like I should carry Chris around with me everywhere. Thank you so much for being so generous with your comments. And so I think I'm going to start from the present and kind of move backwards. So I'll start with the kind of pleas for reparations question, and I like the way in which you centered the slavery as birth defect. With Condoleezza Rice stating that. And so Charlotte Fettenai, who's another historian of slavery and medicine, whose work I greatly admire, but also has helped to shape mine, we co-wrote a piece that'll be coming out in the American Journal of Public Health. And a part of the intro that I really wanted us to talk about was this notion that racism, is this ill, this stain on society. And so I'll start with the embattled Virginia Governor, Ralph Northam. So I'm going to just read a little bit of that, just a quote. So after Northam's past was kind of highlighted and amplified by political rivals of the far right, and this picture of him in blackface, right, that he says was him, and it wasn't him, and, then he says, well, I was dressed like Michael Jackson, and we know how, the different iterations of Michael Jackson's face, kind of have shifted. He then uses this quote, right now, we need someone who can heal, there's no better person to do that than a doctor. So to think about Condoleezza Rice, right, slavery as the birth defect of this nation, and to also think about Northam as a pediatric neurosurgeon, believing in the kind of value-neutral stance that medicine and doctors have is a part of the problem, right? That racism then becomes a public health crisis, and so what is the solution, or at least part of the solution for that? I have to be honest, I wrote this originally as a case for reparations before Coates makes that, before he makes that kind of claim for a more mainstream American audience, and that was shaped by my own understandings of living in the South, going to historically black colleges, not writing history for history's sake, not writing a history just to get tenure, or to win a book award, but I wanted to know how to deal with racism as a public health crisis, and how would the country then respond to these kinds of things. So I thought, as a responsible historian, what you do is lay out a history using sources that can't be refuted. So I am literally using the same sources that many folk had used before me. So a part of that is now working with various groups who understand racism as a public health crisis. And at the center of public health is prevention. So how do you go about preventing the effects of racism on the Black body? So part of what I'm doing with this work is working in conjunction with, in particular, Black women, OBGYNs, and medical practitioners who are challenging medical production in schools. So in the state of California, I'm working with Karen Scott, who is a Black OBGYN, but also has a master's in public health, and is also getting a PhD. And so a part of what she's done, along with some other researchers, is she secured, I think now almost $2 million to essentially transform medical education in the state of California. And so my book will then be made legible to a medical staff and medical practitioners. So whether those people are doulas, midwives, nurses, doctors, it will help to disabuse many of them who graduate from schools who are still using texts that talk about the biological distinctiveness of Black and white people in really harmful ways. So that's one way that I am, kind of pushing this historical scholarship to change some of the problems around medical racism. So then answering the other question about surgery as brutal, and it's really a question about context and time, like chronology. It's interesting. Some of the critiques that have emerged, not really inside of the academic world, but really outside of the academic world with activists, was the kind of intentional cruelty of these doctors, right? That they were intent on brutalizing and butchering enslaved women. And so it was, it has been and continues to be a really uncomfortable place for me, because I often have to say, wait, let me tell you what slavery actually meant for people who lived during this time, and that no doctor worth his salt is going to intentionally damage the reproductive parts of enslaved women, because just as Sasha Turner pointed out, and you have scholars like Jennifer Morgan, there is the condition of a child following its mother if the mother is enslaved, right? And that happens as early as 1662 in colonial Virginia. And I'm just talking about the British context, but you can find this in almost every European empire that has a slave nation or slave state. And so it goes against the nature of slavery for a doctor to want to damage the reproductive health of enslaved women. And so for me, it is really trying to understand intentionality and brutality in a different way. And that overall, the practice of medicine was really exploratory and experimental, even without these doctors using that terminology. Because nothing had really been set in stone. It was really about the kind of changing nature, the transitional nature of medicine during that time. And I was hoping that my book really showed this kind of dynamic nature, that it was, it was always changing. People were always trying to figure things out in the antebellum era. In terms of humans, the kind of humanity question, like slavery is inhumane or humane, and you're kind of pushing back against my treatment of it, I am very specific and very intentional about the use of inhumanity, because 21st century historians say enslaved persons. But if we look at the historical archives, they were slaves and they were property. And so the reason that, at least in the US, I had such access to these records is because those men were concerned about their property. And so it was much harder for me to be able to identify sources for poor Irish immigrant women, because they were free, they weren't owned. And so in understanding that enslaved people, African people, enter into the archives as objects and commodities, I can't act as if that is humane, right? I mean, they are literally, Stephanie Smallwood writes about this with the commodification process that happens on the slave ship during the transatlantic slave trade. And so a part of me constantly using a language of flesh and blood, the human story, is to also recognize the duality, the kind of binary identity of enslaved people, that legally they are almost always on record as objects. But I have to also recognize that a chair doesn't breathe. A chair can't be operated on. But a slave as an object and subject can be. And so that's what I wanted people to kind of, wrestle with in reading this, and to understand it wasn't a political way for me to somehow, as Sasha talked about, sanitize what the enslaved person or the slave meant, but to understand that as much as I moved between enslaved and slave, that's what they represented in that society. It was only until emancipation that all black people shared the same status, right? Until 1865 in this country. And so that's why I was really, making people see that there was intentionality between the use of slave and enslaved. With the regard, and I really like the paternalism question because it's a geeky antebellum question. And
I limited myself to one of those.
Yes, exactly. It's like a great 19th century U.S. question about Southern paternalism, but it's also, and the thing is too, people think everything's been written about it, and it hasn't. Right? Especially when we think about medicine, because medicine always comes down to one of the examples that slave owners and pro-slavery ideologues kind of pointed to, right? If you are a black person and you're free and you're living in a free state, you're more prone to mental illness, right? White people don't really care about black people because they've allowed them to descend into a state of primitive, a kind of primitive state in the North, in ways that, the Southern great white father has not in the South. And so they can point to the ways that they have created hospitals for their slaves, asylums for their slaves. Even in the area of discipline, it's been medicalized, that the lash and corporal punishment becomes a kind of, loving way to chastise the slave who exists in a state of arrested development. And so I think that with the kind of complication of the historiography of Southern paternalism using the lens of medicine, you start to see that paternalism is not necessarily based on a kind of benevolent stance towards black people, right? But it's really based on the needs of the labor system, the economic labor system that slavery creates. So for instance, when I talk about, very briefly, the medicalization of rape, for instance, right? The slave is not considered ever to be a victim of rape. Just doesn't exist. Now, there are certain exceptions. If the slave is 10 years or younger, 10 years of age or younger in certain states, maybe 8 years or younger in certain states. But those are exceptions. By and large, black women primarily, but also black men cannot be raped. Because the science says that the highly sexual nature, the lascivious nature, the hypersexuality of the African doesn't allow them to be raped. But what happens when the property is damaged? And now there's a medicalization of rape. And that enters into court records and medical journals. And there's a kind of pedagogical moment that people have to learn about the effects of the rape. And so how then does Southern paternalism, right, respond to those needs? And so that's what the history of medicine allows us to do, right, is to really flesh out what paternalism means, because it also shows the hypocrisy of white slave owners and white men in particular, because good fathers don't rape their children, right? This is incestuous in some ways. And so even though I don't speak about that explicitly, I think there's a kind of implied intimation that I'm also showing the hypocrisy of paternalism in that sense. Let's see, I also wanted to talk about some of the questions that you asked in terms of the erasure of blackness. So I deal with that. I mean, obviously it's a book that centers enslaved women, so I am, very, very, intent on putting their voices, their stories, their lived experiences back into the historiography. But beyond that, I also deal with knowledge production. and the ways that not just doctors, but also those involved in the publishing industry during the antebellum period in particular are going against the racial cognitive dissonance that I mentioned before, going against the actual reality. So for instance, I have a few images in the book, and I also nod to the journal Souls, published out of Columbia University, but a really, really brilliant scholar, Nicole Ivey, who has written about this as well. The ways that medical journal articles, when it comes to OBGYN work, they will write in terms of the language about the negress or the slave. But the images will be of white women, right? And I mean, so we talk about a literal erasure, right? The images are literally of white women, even though the text will say the negress did X, Y, and Z, or the slave owned by so-and-so and so. And so there's a kind of literal erasure of black folk there. And the funny thing is, the doctors are not the ones instructing the illustrators to do this. The doctors are actually quite honest and transparent about who they're performing these surgeries and experiments on. So it is literally the nature of the 19th century world that is so cleaved in terms of race that without instruction, they turn these women white. So a part of me is also showing that. The other kind of knowledge production too is the ways that doctors are training not just their peers, but also those invested in the institution of slavery about how to treat black bodies, right? And so you have voluminous records on, the temperature needed for black people as they're healing or when they're sick, or the different ways that you respond to black people. And so knowledge production becomes really important because it also helps to bind together white men's fraternity, right? The kind of fraternal relationships that they have around race and class and status. Let's see, the other thing is, lastly, I'm trying to respond to all of the comments that you made. Black women as medical super bodies. So the sameness, otherness, I mean, it's pretty clear, right? In the very ways that these doctors can write about the Negro clavicle, the black ankle, just everything you can think of, and yet and still they continue to use black bodies to cure the universal normal body, which is white. And so, medical super bodies then becomes this kind of fraught term because it goes back and forth. It's like the slave is object and subject. So the medical super body can withstand all of the trauma of surgery. It can withstand more pain, but at the same time, they also recognize the fragility of the black body. So for instance, freedom causes the black body to decline and to descend into madness, for instance. And so with the medical super body, it's a fraught term, but once again, I think it's trying to show the duality of the duality of what it means to be a black person living in a society where people are free and unfree.
Okay, I think we can take a few questions for our panel, and then after our panelists have a chance to respond, we'll then transition into a general discussion to close the afternoon. So first we'll just hear from the audience questions for our panelists.
So this question for Sasha, and it sort of touches on a question that Professor Dodman made earlier in the day about what is historically specific and what can we view in a long durée. So maybe asking about some of the applicability of this project to thinking about contemporary reproduction. And this might be wrong, so feel free to just be like, no. So we've come to understand the centrality of the slave trade and enslaved people to the development of capitalism as such, right? One of the things that it seems like contemporary capitalism is dealing with is social reproduction, is the ability of women to be laborers that also have to reproduce. And I'm thinking of stories like in the New York Times recently about Amazon warehouses and people miscarrying Amazon warehouses, people in nail salons in New York City who are miscarrying because of their labor conditions and things like this. Do you think that there is
Oh,
Answer any questions, and then we'll open the floor to audience Q&A. Please write down questions as you're listening, and I hope we can have a very rich and generative conversation. All right, so Deirdre Cooper Owens, who is at my left, but not my most extreme left, is an associate professor of history at Queens College, CUNY in Queens, New York. She's an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. She served as an American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology Fellow in Washington, D.C., and is a board member for the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. She earned her PhD from UCLA. As a popular public speaker, she's published essays, book chapters, and blog pieces on a number of issues that concern African American experiences. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, which we'll hear about today, won the 2018 Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the OAH as the best book written in African American women's and gender history. Professor Cooper Owens is also the director of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia, the country's oldest cultural institution, founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731. She's working on a second book project that examines mental illness during the era of United States slavery, and is also writing a popular biography of Harriet Tubman that examines her through the lens of disability. In fall 2019, she will join the Department of History at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln as the inaugural Linda and Charles Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine and the Director of the Humanities in Medicine program. Congratulations. Sasha Turner is the author of Contested Bodies, Pregnancy, Childrearing, and Slavery in Jamaica, which examines the struggle for control over biological reproduction and how central childbearing was to the organization of plantation work, the care of slaves, and the development of culture. She completed a PhD at Cambridge University, and she is an associate professor of history at Quinnipiac University, where she teaches courses on the Caribbean and the African diaspora, women, piracy, colonialism, and slavery. She's just completed a fellowship at Yale University's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Her research on gender, race, and the body, and women, children, and emotions has been published in the Journal of Women's History, Slavery and Abolition, and Caribbean Studies, and has been supported by Rutgers University Race, Ethnicity, and Gender Studies Fellowship, Washington University of St. Louis African and African American Studies Fellowship, and the Richard Civil War Era Center and Africana Research Center Fellowship at the Pennsylvania State University. And she is also conducting research on a new book project, which is tentatively titled Slavery, Emotions, and Gendered Power. And so I'll now just proceed right on and introduce our two respondents. Christopher Florio is a member of the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at Columbia. I'm delighted to announce he will be taking up a new faculty post at Hollins University this fall. He received his PhD in history from Princeton University and has research interests in the history of the US and the world and the history of slavery and freedom. He's at work on a book about the problem of poverty during the Anglo-American age of slave emancipation. An article stemming from this project was the recipient of the Lewis Peltzer Memorial Award from the Organization of American Historians and has been published in the Journal of American History. He's also a member of the Justice and Education Initiative here at Columbia, and he teaches courses at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. Christabel Silva is an associate professor of English and comparative literature, and he will be joining the English department at UCLA this fall. He emphasizes not only that, he specializes in colonial and 18th century literatures and cultures of the Americas, with a particular emphasis on the history of medicine. His first book, Miraculous Plagues, An Epidemiology of Early New England Narrative, examines the intertwined evolution of New England's literary and epidemiological histories. His new book in progress, Republic of Medicine, is a literary history of the late 18th century Atlantic world that examines the pathogens, treatments, and medical narratives that shadow the slave trade between the 7 Years' War and the Haitian Declaration of Independence. We're delighted to have you all with us today. So we'll begin the conversation with Deirdre Cooper Owens introducing medical bondage.
So let me extend my appreciation to my colleagues, especially those organizers affiliated with the Society of Fellows in the Humanities, for producing this workshop. I'm also grateful for the comments that Chris will provide about my book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology. Sasha Turner and I have been friends for a very long time, and so she can tell you I am an extemporaneous speaker, but I don't trust myself because I've been doing a lot of travel, so I'm just going to set it up with a few written words and then speak a little more off the cuff about the genealogy of medical bondage and what I set out to do. So I'm going to open with a quotation from the Black Book. I am the Black Book. Between my top and my bottom, my right and my left, I hold what I have seen, what I have done, and what I have thought. I am everything I have hated, labor without harvest, death without honor, life without land or law. Toni Morrison wrote this as the preface to the Black Book in 1973. And after writing Medical Bondage, I've read numerous works about medical experimentation, biomedical ethics, James Marion Sims, and enslaved women patients. I was most inspired by Koya Fagan Maple's book of poetry, historical poetry, entitled Men, about the enslaved women experimented on by Dr. James Marion Sims, and Toni Morrison's edited The Black Book, a literary and historical repository of dazzling stories, art, images, and heart-wrenching stories of Black people's losses across time and space. And it literally just poses as a book. I think it's so much more. And in the interim of writing Medical Bondage and being able to revisit some of the themes that I wrote about in other people's work, I have been allowed to ponder what I said I would accomplish and what I actually did accomplish through my argumentation and evidence. And so any historical work on slavery that begins with revisionist history, and that is, I know, a pejorative term in certain circles, but one I wear proudly, that places the site of women's professional health, the first women's hospital, on a slave farm as opposed to a Manhattan street, forces the reader to reimagine the whole history of American gynecology as being intimately connected to slavery and Black women's labor, both reproductive and manual. The first sentence on the first page of my book, and I quote, "The first women's hospital in the United States was housed on a small slave farm in Mount Meigs, Alabama, a lumber town about 15 miles from Montgomery, a large slave trading center." It does this exactly. And so I really set out to centralize slavery and Black women primarily as patients and healthcare workers in the long history of gynecologic medicine in the United States. And I had to reckon with the intersection of medicine and slavery as a lens through which we all can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. And so beyond this, I wanted to write a patient-centered monograph that complicated the ways the history of medicine had been written about previously. Now, I'll do what I do best. So, you know, I often trace how I came to this project, and it was not my intention to be a historian of medicine. I literally kind of stumbled into the field. I do a lot of public speaking, and when I was a grad student at UCLA, was going to moderate a conversation between Dr. Janetta Cole, who was the then president of my undergraduate institution, and Reverend James Lawson, a civil rights icon. And so in prepping for my role, Dr. Cole and Beverly Guy Sheftel, one of the architects of Black womanist thought, had co-written a book called Gender Talk. And literally, in the middle of the book, about 2 or 3 sentences, I learned about this man, James Marion Sims, who was called the father of American gynecology. And I learned about his experimental work on enslaved women in Alabama. Had no clue. And what was really disappointing for me, I thought, being a graduate of 2 historically Black colleges, one that was a women's college, and having a master's degree in African American studies, I thought I knew everything there was to know. And here was this kind of hidden history that connected slavery and medicine, right? Because medical experimentation had always been centered in the 20th century. And this is, you know, this is before Henrietta Lacks's story was known. It was almost always centered on men. And so as I started to do more research, I learned about Sims's work later on poor Irish immigrant women in New York. And I thought, this is great for a dissertation and a comparative history. And so it really opened up a world for me to be able to see the functions of slavery as an economic labor system, right? And how that economic labor system seemed to have a place in a burgeoning field of medicine, like gynecology. And so what I wanted to do was also write a patient-centered history. Right? So it's really interesting the way my career has unfolded, because I had never seen myself as a historian of medicine. I always saw myself as a historian of the U.S. South, the 19th century, and slavery. And I remember I have a writing partner connected here at Columbia, Sam Roberts, and I was just kind of bemoaning that I didn't want to go to a history of medicine conference because I felt like a fraud. You know, I'm a slavery historian. And he was like, so what's the first word in your book? And I said medical. He was like, what's the last word? I was like, gynecology. He was like, you know, I kind of think you're a historian of medicine. And so it allowed me, though, to really wrestle with the kind of erasure of slavery and Black women in particular in the histories of medicine, where I didn't want to just focus on the disease. I didn't want to just focus kind of on the great men of medicine. They're important. They perform the work. But I also wanted to talk about the institution that allowed them access to these vulnerable patient populations. And I also wanted to see, because there had been work done before I wrote Medical Bondage, what kinds of new interpretations could one gather from centering the lens to focus on Black women who were enslaved, or even Irish immigrant women. And so I started to come up with new insights about the history of racial formation theory and ideas in antebellum America. I started to have new questions emerge around biomedical ethics. And it wasn't necessarily the questions that guided people who were really angry at Sims for not using anesthesia on his patients. Because I'm like, well, I do the antebellum era. Nobody really used anesthesia on patients. So that wasn't like a big issue for me. But it was these ideas around Blackness and femaleness that seemed to go against the very practice that these men like Sims and some of the others I write about, John Peter Matower and Ephraim McDowell, there's a bunch of them I write about in the first chapter. I was really interested in their embrace of a racial ideology, right, that really was a kind of reigning paradigm in the antebellum era throughout the Atlantic world, and yet what they did was so very different than what they wrote. So for instance, they believed in biological differences between Black and white people, and yet they used Black women to kill white women. They talked about Black women not experiencing pain or being able to better manage pain, and yet in those same medical journal articles, you would see sentences like, Betsy lost sense of herself and struggled violently. We had to have another assistant, restrain her. And I'm thinking, how can someone struggle violently and lose sense of themselves, right? They're experiencing pain. And so here was this racial cognitive dissonance that I wanted to bring to the table, but also the ways in which a lot of the histories of medicine that focused on the great men were really hagiographic in some ways. And also, I recognized that the history of medicine folk didn't necessarily have an understanding of slavery. And so that's what I wanted to also bring into the conversation, right? You had to understand the United States, you had to understand the landscape of slavery and what that meant. And in particular, the very distinct ways that Black women were treated. And so my intention was to really show all of that by centering Black women. So I'm gonna kind of end here because I know I only had 7 to 10 minutes. A really wonderful example of this, I think, came in the ways that I approached the archives. So when you're writing about enslaved people who are largely illiterate, they don't leave written records, everything that I extract from the archives is literally through the writings, through the voice of the men who owned them or who performed experiments on them. So I'm like, how do I somehow, rescue voices that have been muted? And I recognized I couldn't be their voice because I didn't want to ventriloquize these women. And so I started to just look at the same sources in different ways by centering these enslaved women. So one source in particular that shows up in various articles and books about Sims in particular is the 1850 census. And for anybody who studies the 19th century US, we know that the 1850 census is the first time you have a racial classification for Black people listed as mulatto. And so a part of my own archival experience is also bringing my lived experience into the archives. And I know historians are not supposed to do that. We're supposed to be objective. But come on, right? We all bring our experiences into the archives. And I'm married to someone who has a white mother and a black father. And so I'm always kind of constantly aware about racial classifications and how they've changed in particular. And so I remember being in the National Archives looking at this census, and I said, what if I looked at the census not as a record of Sims's wealth, as had been written before? Sims owned 17 slaves, so this means he was a man of middling wealth. But I started to look at it from the vantage point of those people that he leased or owned. What could I come up with? And so I look at the racial classification, Negro, 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 you just saw N, M. And so I'm like, who is the M, right? Of these 17 enslaved folk that Sims leased or owned. The M, the mulatto, is the youngest person on the slave farm, this little mulatto girl born during the experimental trial. Right? That was hard to hold for 10 years because I graduated in 08 and the book comes out almost 10 years later. But it provided me an insight. Now I could start to look at what Sims wrote about around that time in his autobiography. And he writes about this moment that the community, and then what that means is the white community, withdrew support. And so he intimates that it was largely because the experimental phase was unsuccessful, that there had been these intimations that perhaps he was using the enslaved women like guinea pigs, he was losing money, he was spending time away from his family. But what the census allowed me to do was say, wait, this was around the time this patient was pregnant and gave birth to a mulatto child. Now, I can't talk about who the father is and any of those things because the census doesn't allow you to do that. But what it does allow me to do is now ask different questions based on biomedical ethics. And so, even though it's a pretty slim, concise book, what I wanted to do was really have us raise the specter of what life was like for enslaved people and how they also, through their work, their bodies, their experiences, shaped American medicine, and in this case, American gynecology. So I will stop here.
We'll hear next from Sasha to introduce comparative bodies.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I too would like to extend thank you to the conveners and organizers and the Society of Fellows in the Humanities here, and of course to our two respondents this afternoon who will be engaged with their work. And thank you, audience, for being here. I know I'm sort of struggling with sleep and sort of wanting to be outside where it's just really wonderful, so thank you for being here. And I do sort of hope the panel sort of works out to be high octane, as Arden suggests. So the origins of contested bodies and sort of thinking through its genealogy comes through, I think, it has three roots, and I'll sort of talk about two today. One is sort of coming from the archive, and the second is sort of the theoretical literature that I was sort of reading at the time, and how that sort of came to be very much serendipitously. So I really didn't set out